WNST, Towson, Baltimore, your parts for all things hockey and the Rock the Red and a Capital celebration. This guy is a part of this every single year. He's been a long-time National Hockey League writer and columnist and contributor and news guy and information guy and storyteller. He is now with The Athletic. I saw him many, many times during the course of the Caps stretch run. I think he lives out of a suitcase like all NHL writers do for about 10 weeks. We welcome Scott Burnside back. He is Overtime Scott B out on Twitter, and hundreds of thousands follow him for his puck coverage. Scott Burnside, number 8, Alex Ovechkin lifts the cup to the sky. Surprised, shocked, or just did you think it was a matter of time at some point?
Yeah, I think the bigger question actually is, will anyone pry the cup out of his fingers between now and the start of training camp? And I think that's the bigger question. But no, I spent a lot of time really since Alex Ovechkin came into the league in the 05-06 season. Certainly, I was at his first Game 7, a loss to Philadelphia. I believe it was 08. I think you do wonder, right? And I'm sure Ovechkin and Nicholas Backstrom and Jay Beagle and a lot of the long-standing Capitals wondered if it was ever going to happen for them. And so to say, well, it was only a matter of time. I mean, I guess that's how it turned out. But I think it was fair for a lot of people to wonder, was Alex Ovechkin going to be one of those great athletes, a la Dan Marino, pick your poison. I think of some of the other hockey guys, Joe Thornton, who's never won a cup, players in my mind who are, surefire Hall of Famers, but who may never get a chance to have their name etched on the Stanley Cup. And you wondered if Alex Ovechkin was going to be, one of those kinds of players. And now that question has been answered. And it's, for me, it's been interesting to watch just the reaction, not just from the players, but from the entire community. And I think this is what makes this sport great. And it's certainly what, I talked to one NHL executive who said, listen, this victory gives everyone in the NHL hope, right? It gives all communities, all fan bases, all teams. It gives them hope that it can happen if you stick to your plan, if you're patient, and sometimes you have to be a lot more patient than you'd like to be. But I think the Capitals' victory and watching Alex Ovechkin raise the cup is something that reaffirms that it can happen, and that it's not going to happen for everyone. This is a team and a franchise and a community that waited an awful long time for the first Stanley Cup. And it happened. And so there's hope now that I think in every other NHL city, the other 30 teams saying, okay, well, if the Capitals, why not us?
Well, I think if you go back from the beginning, and I thought about the narrative of all this. I mean, I guess this whole thing started when they selected Alex Ovechkin. That's the beginning of the story, right? And then there's how do we find the players and the leadership around this obviously special player who's in bloom? How do we use this and win championships with this to have this transcendent player? And it just took him a long time to figure it out. I think my pal Barry Trotz has a major role in this and was playing the role of the village idiot when they were down 0-2 and Grubauer had started the first 2 games. But this is there's a lot of arteries and a lot of veins to how this thing happened. But I would say beyond Ovechkin, then there comes all of the coaches that came along that were sort of sucked in and out through this by his ability and by how heavy the stone got to be to push up the hill to get this done.
Yeah, well, there's no question, and the Barry Trotz narrative is a powerful one, and and I think the way it's unfolded, it tells you a lot about where maybe that patience had worn thin, and certainly the loss to the Penguins last spring in the second round, Game 7, a game that frankly the Capitals weren't very good in, and the Penguins going on to win a second straight Stanley Cup, and the fact that Barry Trotz's contract was not extended. Where Todd Reardon's the assistant was, where Brian McClellan, the GM, had his contract extended. And I think everyone understood, okay, well, maybe, is it time? And certainly the first quarter of this season, which wasn't very good for the Capitals, there was a lot of up and down. And I think really a lot of recovery from that loss to the Penguins last spring. And until they sort of got it, and there is no one who talks the game and who explains things better than Barry Trotz. And I remember sitting down with him in Tampa during the East Final, and he talked about coming sort of a moment of clarity for himself. And, obviously disappointing not to have, the contract situation, the way it unfolded. But really, I thought a guy who became fully at peace with himself, fully at peace with, what his legacy was going to be. It wasn't going to be dependent entirely on winning a cup or not winning a cup. It's about family. It's about the company you keep. It's about the person you are. And I think that sort of comfort, that sort of, I'll refer to it several, there is a guy who was very zen during a very emotional season and then a very emotional playoff run. As you mentioned, losing 2 at home to start against Columbus, you lose game 1 against Pittsburgh in a game which you controlled really until the end of the third period. You lose 3 in a row in the middle of the Eastern Conference Final before turning it on and winning 2 elimination games, and then bounce back from a sloppy game 1 in the final to win 4 straight. So, Barry Trotz is very much the hand on the tiller in this Stanley Cup victory. And I'll be frankly very shocked if he's not back behind the bench in Washington next fall, but who knows how it's going to play out. But certainly full marks to a man who also, like Alex Ovechkin, his resume and his story now is a lot more complete and a lot more full now that he has guided this team to a championship.
Well, that's the truth for all these guys, right, Scott? I mean, that goes with all of them. And, for Orpik to sort of be out in front of it, and they brought Niskanen in a couple of years ago, and all the inherent players, to your point, the Beagles and the Hopies and the guys that had been around this, and Backstrom been around it forever. Oshie's an interesting transplant into this thing, right? Like, the Shattenkirk thing didn't work out so great last year. The Oshie thing worked out so well that they gave him all the money. They signed him to this crazy long-term deal that a lot of folks poo-pooed. They obviously locked up Kuznetsov at a point where he was still sort of coming along, but they didn't really know what they had with him or when he was going to turn it on. And a lot of these guys have emerged, as you always see with championship teams, all sort of at the same point. And then there's all the role players, the DSPs and the Ellers and, the guys, the Brett Connollys that did think Kempney coming into this thing at the trading deadline and being the perfect part for all this. A lot of perfect parts as we look at it in retrospect.
Well, and that's always the way, really, for the Stanley Cup, right? You think about, the misses that Vegas had in this series, a chance to tie it late in Game 2, and, Alex Tuch is stopped by Braden Holtby. You think about the misses early in Game 4 in Washington, and James Neal and Riley Smith unable to hit the back of open nets, things like that. But that happens every single spring. Every single spring there's a crossbar or a miss that woulda, coulda, shoulda. But you're right. To me, it's more how the players step forward at critical times. Lars Eller was a huge factor when Nicholas Backstrom was injured late in the Pittsburgh series with a hand injury. He came in and filled in admirably when Evgeny Kuznetsov went out late in the first period of Game 2 of an important game for the Caps. Devontae Smith-Pelly, you mentioned, what a terrific story. 7 playoff goals, matching his regular season output, including a huge goal in Game 5, the deciding game, up and down that lineup. Jacob Vrana, and it's interesting when you think about the young players, and this is why people, this is not nearly as good a team on paper as the Caps had the last 2 years, or in 2010 when they won a President's Trophy and went out in the first round against the Montreal Canadiens. This is a team that relied on young players to take big bites. They relied on players to come in and out of the lineup, sometimes playing their first ever NHL playoff games in the heat of a playoff run, and answering the call. And I think that's what makes, these guys, maybe you always like the guys you win with, but this seems like a special group. They're a group that, certainly the nucleus understood the pains and the disappointments and the shortcomings of the past and really rose to the occasion when they could have knuckled at any point during this playoff run. So I think it tells a great story, and it's a story that resonates. It resonates across sport, and it resonates certainly throughout that community. And I think it resonates across the NHL landscape in a really meaningful way.
Scott Burnside joins us now. He is Overtime Scott B. He's now with The Athletic after many, many years at the Worldwide Leader. You can follow him at Overtime Scott B on Twitter, as well as at theathletic.com, where he's covering all things puck. And, you said special story, and, I've watched so many people in the national space, and, I was there night after night with these people people that have sort of chronicled Barry Trotz through all of the Nashville period of time and Korea and a couple of close calls. Had a couple of decent teams in 11 and 12 as well. But such a well-liked guy and not a well-traveled guy because all he did was kind of hang out in Nashville forever. But you mentioned that people could feel good about stories throughout this thing. This one feels like there were very few naysayers. Even the Canadian folks that always hated Ovechkin have sort of come around to respecting what he represents and the way he's played the game. Probably respected him more after he's rolling around drunk in the fountain with the cup and waking up in bed. That's almost a Canadian thing to do, right? Wake up in bed with the Stanley Cup. Everybody has sort of fallen in love with this team, but also the Vegas story, I think, brought people into the story that may have been on the outside who were a Red Wings fan or a Sharks fan or a fan of somewhere else. Will say, well, I'm not going to watch this year. I think it was a very compelling reason to watch for folks who may not have been interested in Winnipeg and Tampa, let's say.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And it's in the same way that a year ago, I think a lot of the casual fans were brought in by the love affair in Nashville with that team as they went to a surprise Stanley Cup final, the first ever for that franchise, and how the local country music or the music community really rallied behind, and there was a sort of star quality to what the Predators were doing, even though it's a small market team. And I think what you saw with Vegas is different marketplace, different kind of vibe, but the same kind of, hey, that's a really cool story. And again, players that have been cast off by their teams and through the expansion process. And, would people care in Vegas? Would anyone show up? Would it only be visiting fans? Now, I will say I was shocked in Game 5 to see as many Capitals fans in there. And it must have been a giant boost to the local economy given the prices that I'm sure people were asking for those tickets. But, it's turned into a hockey town very, very quickly, certainly far more quickly than I think anyone could have imagined, even Commissioner Gary Bettman. And it's been fun to go out to the practice facility in Vegas and see the people lined up there, and you see the kids who signed up for youth hockey. And, those are such important building blocks. And that's it's a good organization with good people in it. Bill Foley, the owner, Murray Craven, longtime NHLer, has been instrumental in the practice facility and the youth movement there. Those are important things because it's not going to happen like this every year for Vegas, right? I mean, I don't know what the odds will be, but the odds of them getting back to a final next year would be extremely long once again, and that's the nature of the game. But I think, what you hope is that they really build on what was a magical season, fell just short, but still magical, and that the grassroots hockey, which is so important in those kinds of marketplaces, that they continue to plow money into it and to keep, continue to foster love of the game, because that's what sustains you when you don't, they're going to have a season or two or 3 or 4 or whatever it is where they don't make the playoffs or they're in transition, whatever happens in the next 4 or 5 or 6 years. But this year is a tremendous stepping stone for building something long-term and meaningful there. And I think they're obviously off, certainly headed in the right direction, in terms of that, the long-term, long-standing success.
Well, Scott, we'd say the same thing here in Baltimore, where we are not just a secondary market, kind of a tertiary market. We don't even have a minor league team here and haven't in 25 years, and I chronicled all that. And my background with Trotz is the Baltimore Skipjacks coach many, many years ago. But Baltimore got a 12 share, in the finals, and people here were watching and people here were engaged. You talk about growing the market and, what happens when a kid from Arizona becomes the #1 pick overall in the draft and runs off to the hottest hotbed of hockey ever to try to win a championship there. That is the legacy of the game, I think, during this period of time. And I was talking to Trotz about it 2 months ago, that Nashville thing last year, it was for him like building a mansion and watching someone else come in and swim around in the pool. That's kind of what happened last year. But for the Capitals, they have left this thing in a pretty good position right now for the next 5 or 10 years. Not just that Ovechkin's not going to be put out to pasture anytime soon, and the Oshis and the Backstroms are signed, at least for one more year in his case, but they're going to bring back a core group of players that is going to energize, I think, the fan base for the next 2 or 3 years, that they'll at least be playoff worthy. They're not going to go into the dirt and become a 70-point team.
No, I don't think so. And it's so difficult to win back-to-back, and the fact that Pittsburgh did it in 16 and 17 again defies logic a little bit, but I think you start with a guy like Sidney Crosby. And now, you're right. I mean, we've seen what Alex Ovechkin can do, a worthy Conn Smythe Trophy winner as the playoff MVP. I must admit, my number one vote, I agonized over it for the last, the 2 or 3 days leading up to Game 5, and I had Evgeny Kuznetsov. And for me, that's the real, in terms of a torch being passed, I mean, you can already, you understand that Kuznetsov is on the cusp of being a top 5 player, point production. He's already, for me, one of the most exciting players in the NHL to watch. And to have that kind of, passing of the torch, already in place, even though Alex Ovechkin has got, 3, 4, 5 more years of productive hockey, whatever the number is going to be, from still the same. TJ Oshie, you mentioned that. Braden Holtby finally putting some of his own playoff demons behind him this year. An elite goaltender, which is so important, goes without saying. So, the odds tell you the Caps can't win it again next year, but the odds said the same thing about Pittsburgh 2 years ago. And this team is so good down the middle. They're so good in goal. Whether John Carlson comes back or not. I mean, some of those things are, there's always going to be change, and it's both inevitable and I think desirable. You can't just say, well, let's bring the same 20 guys back and hope we get the same amount of puck luck and posts and all those things. It doesn't happen that way. You have to change your roster. You have to change how the roles evolving. Next year, does Andre Burakovsky have a bigger role? Where does Jacob Vrana fit in? We saw Tom Wilson ascend to a top line role, certainly playing top 6 minutes, killing penalties. Is he ready for an even bigger bite? So, those are things that I think are exciting for Caps fans, because it's not a team that is, the window was opened and now it's closed. I think this is a team that, a given, frankly, to make the playoffs, and then, see what happens once again. But it's hard to win twice in a row. But boy, it's pretty hard to win once, and the Caps have done that.
Well, we'll all towel off, and I know you'll be headed to Dallas. You got drafting to do and all that stuff. And boy, there is no downtime when you win the Stanley Cup, right? Like when it ends from a scouting standpoint, from all of that, and it's the same way, I guess, in the NFL and every other sport, where you're sort of behind a little bit by a month, and you've been partying and drinking in the champagne. Winning's tough because there's no down season, right?
Well, that's everyone wants that short summer. That's the thing. It's going to be short for Vegas as well, but no, it'll be very short for the Caps and their players and their staff. And that's always. I know people have been joking about the Cup has already got a hangover, but there is that's inevitable too. But I think again, the good thing for the Capitals, they sort of went through that this year, right? I mean, it will be hard for them to gear back up after this kind of emotional expenditure, and it will be hard to gear up after a short summer. But you know what? It took them a while to get their footing a year ago. So they'll understand that, I think, a lot better this, coming back into the 18-19 season. But yeah, it will be a summer to remember for all of those players, all the staff, the coaches, management, and they should. It's something that, that's why you do it, right? You should, you never know if you're going to get back here again. It took 44 years to do the first one. If I'm the Capitals and I'm taking full advantage of the summer, even if it takes me a while to get my legs under me in October.
First 48 hours with the Cup, they partied as much as anybody, right? I mean, they were rock stars with the Cup, right?
Yeah, that's it. Exactly. One for the ages.
Great to have you on, Scott Burnside. Always good to visit with you and spend some time in the hockey season. I hope I get a nice long run with you next May and June, too. How about that?
All right. Sounds good.
You got it. Scott Burnside joining us here. He is Overtime. Scott B. He's with The Athletic. No one covering the National Hockey League better and longer than him. You can find him at theathletic.com and Overtime Scott B. We didn't get a lot of overtime toward the end as well. I was waiting for the all-nighter, the double and the triple overtimers. Those have not gone well historically for Caps or Caps fans. So maybe that's one of the good news stories, is that they avoided the overtime and the overtime loss and the double overtime loss and the triple overtime loss, and everything else that I've become familiar with. The BuyAToyota.com audio vault is there for you 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device to listen in. Tune in whenever you want, from wherever you want, to whatever you want. And, of course, our YouTube Live as well as our Facebook Live there. I'm on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook, as well as each and every morning we appear in the morning newspaper at 7 a.m. You sign up at WNST.net once. You get that every morning. It's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, as well as our friends at the Maryland Jockey Club. Laurel entries in our morning newspaper every morning, as well as on the front of WNST.net. We have a Triple Crown winner as well in Justify and Bob Baffert. I'll be tracking down Bob before the week is over. We've got, let's see, Golden State Warriors, Capitals Championship, U.S. Open, or Ravens on the field, Orioles in last place or fifth place, depending on whom you ask. I am working on my Dear Orioles series. I've completed a blog about raising the Stanley Cup in Las Vegas with Barry Trotz last week and my love of hockey. You can read that at WNST.net as well. Nasty at WNST.net reaches me. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST, Towson, Baltimore. And we never stop talking Baltimore sports